1914 was not the beginning of the war. It was the beginning of a century of planned warfare. While historians debate nationalism, imperialism, and alliances as causes of World War I, a deeper analysis of financial records reveals something far more calculated. A century-long blueprint that transformed conflicts into tools for global financial restructuring. In December 1913, 8 months before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, a secret meeting took place on Jekyll Island. Not to plan an assassination, but to create the Federal Reserve, the mechanism that would make it possible to finance a war of industrial scale. The temporal coincidence is not accidental. You cannot execute the largest conflict in history without first creating the financial infrastructure to sustain it. Max Warburg, brother of Paul Warburg, architect of the Fed, was a financial advisor to the German Kaiser. Nathan Rothschild financed the British war effort. J.P. Morgan lent to the Allies. For the first time in history, the same bankers were financing both sides of a conflict, not by accident, but by design. The pattern that would emerge would be simple and lethal: massive indebtedness, geopolitical tension, inevitable conflict, global financial restructuring. Every war since then follows the same financial blueprint, with technical refinements but maintaining the fundamental structure. But the most disturbing thing is to discover that this was not an experiment. It was the first act of a blueprint that continues to operate today. Ukraine-Taiwan tensions in the Middle East are not isolated events. They are continuations of the same play that began in 1914. If this revelation about how 1914 was the first act of a century-long plan shocked you as much as it shocked me when I connected these financial dots, leave a like. I want to know how many people are seeing for the first time how conflicts are orchestrated through decades. World War I established the perfect template for transforming conflicts into opportunities for financial restructuring. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity: create debt so massive that countries would have no choice but to accept a new global financial order. In 1914, the total debt of European countries was equivalent to 50% of combined GDP. By 1918, it had jumped to 170%. But this was not an accidental consequence of the war. It was the objective. Nathan Rothschild had learned at Waterloo that privileged information generates punctual profits. Controlling the indebtedness of nations generates perpetual power. The operational pattern was precise. First, create financing capacity through central banks. Second, generate tensions that make conflict inevitable. Third, finance both sides to ensure the war lasts long enough to generate maximum indebtedness. Fourth, offer the solution through a new financial architecture. J.P. Morgan was not just lending money to the Allies. He was creating financial dependence. When the war ended, Great Britain owed American banks more than its annual GDP. France was technically bankrupt. Germany was forced to accept reparations that would guarantee decades of financial instability. But the true masterstroke was the creation of the League of Nations, not as a political organization, but as a mechanism for financial coordination. For the first time in history, sovereign countries agreed to submit their economic policies to a supranational authority. The precedent was set. The result was that 1918 did not mark the end of a war, but the birth of a new system: conflicts as tools of global financial engineering. The directors had discovered that wars not only generate profits, they create opportunities to completely restructure world power. World War II was not a new war. It was the same war, second act. The 1914 blueprint had worked so perfectly that the same directors decided to execute it again, with refinements based on lessons learned. The setup was identical: massive indebtedness preceding the conflict. Between 1933 and 1939, Germany increased its debt by 400% through reconstruction programs financed by the same banks that had profited from World War I. It was not secret rearmament. It was planned indebtedness to make conflict inevitable. Share this with anyone who needs to recognize these patterns in current conflicts, because history does not repeat itself, but the financial blueprint remains the same. But this time, the producers had learned to be more sophisticated. Instead of openly financing both sides, they created a network of subsidiaries and intermediary companies. IBM provided calculating machines for the census that identified Jews. Ford built vehicles for the Wehrmacht. Standard Oil sold fuel to the Luftwaffe. All legal, all documented, all profitable. The pattern of bilateral financing was perfected. Wall Street financed the American war effort through war bonds, while European subsidiaries of the same banks financed German reconstruction. Prescott Bush, George W. Bush's grandfather, was literally financing both sides through the Union Banking Corporation. The result was even more spectacular than 1918. Bretton Woods created a completely new global monetary system, with the dollar as the world's reserve currency. For the first time in history, a single national currency became the basis of global trade, not by economic superiority, but by financial design. The UN was created not as a successor to the League of Nations, but as its evolution. This time, global financial coordination would be permanent, not temporary. The World Bank and the IMF would ensure that national indebtedness became perpetual, not just post-war. The template was complete: conflict, indebtedness, restructuring, control. Each element had been tested, refined, and systematized for future replication. The Cold War was the most brilliant evolution of the blueprint: how to maintain the pattern of indebtedness and restructuring without the physical destruction that limited the profits of previous conflicts. For the first time, the directors discovered how to create perpetual war without real war. The mechanism was ingenious: divide the world into two spheres of financial influence, each forced to spend fortunes on armaments that would never be used. The arms race became the perfect economic engine: all the costs of war, none of the risks of infrastructure destruction. Between 1945 and 1991, the United States spent $13 trillion in today's dollars on defense. The Soviet Union spent proportionally even more, eventually leading to economic collapse. But the money did not disappear. It was transferred to the same companies and banks that had financed previous wars. The pattern of bilateral financing evolved into systemic financing. Instead of directly financing both sides, the producers created a system where both sides were forced to perpetually indebt themselves to maintain military parity. The result was the same: massive indebtedness, but the method was more elegant. The crucial innovation was the creation of proxy wars: Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola. Regional conflicts that allowed testing armaments, justifying military spending, and restructuring local economies without the risk of nuclear escalation. Each proxy war followed the same blueprint: bilateral financing, local indebtedness, post-conflict restructuring. The result was that 1991 did not mark the end of the Cold War, but its evolution into the next phase: a unipolar world where the blueprint could be applied globally without the need for a rival superpower. The template had become so sophisticated that it no longer needed real enemies, just perceived threats. With the end of the Soviet Union, the directors faced an unprecedented problem: how to maintain the blueprint of indebtedness and restructuring without a credible existential threat. The solution was brilliant: fragment the global template into multiple, simultaneous regional blueprints. Subscribe here for analyses on how to anticipate the next acts of this blueprint, and because recognizing the pattern is the only way to financially protect yourself from the next restructurings. Vietnam had been the beta test: how to transform a regional war into a driver of national indebtedness. The cost of $120 billion in dollars of the time forced the United States to abandon the gold standard in 1971, creating the fiat currency system that would allow unlimited indebtedness for future conflicts. Iraq, 1991, 2003, perfected the model. Quick wars followed by expensive and prolonged reconstructions. The conflict itself cost $2 trillion. The pattern had evolved. War was just the pretext. Reconstruction was the real business. Afghanistan 2001-2021 was the masterpiece: 20 years of conflict that cost $2.3 trillion, created perpetual dependence on armaments, and ended exactly as planned, with a withdrawal that justifies new spending on preparation for future threats. But the true innovation was the creation of hybrid wars, conflicts that combine military, economic, cyber, and informational elements. Ukraine 2014 present is the first complete example. Localized physical war that generates global indebtedness through sanctions, military spending, and energy restructuring. The modern pattern is even more sophisticated. Instead of directly financing both sides, the producers create systems where all sides are forced to indebt themselves to participate in the conflict. Ukraine indebts itself to buy weapons. Europe indebts itself to replace Russian energy. Russia indebts itself to circumvent sanctions. The United States indebts itself to finance everything. Each regional conflict serves multiple purposes: testing new military technologies, justifying defense spending, restructuring global supply chains, and creating new markets for reconstruction. The blueprint had become a machine for perpetual global financial restructuring. Ukraine is not an isolated conflict. It is the eighth act of the century-long blueprint, designed to restructure the global financial system for the multipolar era. For the first time since 1945, the template is being used to fragment, not consolidate, world financial power. The setup followed the classic pattern: massive indebtedness preceding the conflict. Between 2014 and 2022, Ukraine increased its external debt by $640 billion in international reserves. Europe became dependent on Russian energy. All elements were positioned for the inevitable conflict. But this time, the directors are multiple and competitive, not coordinated. Wall Street finances the Western side. Chinese banks finance alternatives to the SWIFT system. Arab petrodollars create new payment mechanisms. The blueprint is being executed simultaneously by different producers with conflicting objectives. The result is a global financial restructuring in real time. Creation of alternative payment systems, Chinese CBDC, Russian payment system, fragmentation of supply chains, nearshoring, friendshoring, and emergence of regional monetary blocs, BRICS plus, bilateral agreements in local currencies. Taiwan represents the next act, a conflict that would force a complete restructuring of global technological supply chains. Preparatory indebtedness is already happening: China increasing military spending, Taiwan buying American armaments, the United States financing containment in the Pacific. The pattern remains identical to 1914. Indebtedness, tension, conflict, restructuring. The difference is that now multiple actors are executing the blueprint simultaneously, creating not a new world order, but multiple competitive regional orders. The goal is no longer to consolidate global financial power, but to fragment it in a controlled way to create new markets for indebtedness and restructuring in each region. The century-long blueprint has not ended. It has evolved into a phase where multiple directors execute the template simultaneously in different regions. Recognizing the signs allows not only understanding the present, but anticipating and financially protecting oneself from the next acts. The indicators are mathematically precise: accelerated indebtedness in regions of tension, Middle East, Southeast Asia, Africa, formation of military alliances that mirror financial alignments, AUKUS, Quad, China-Russia partnerships, and creation of alternative financial infrastructure that precedes conflicts. The next act will likely be in the Middle East: Iran versus Israel, Saudi Arabia, with preparatory indebtedness already visible in regional military spending and financial alignments, Abraham Accords as economic restructuring, Iran-China partnerships as alternative financing. Individual financial protection follows the historical pattern: assets that benefit from restructurings, essential infrastructure, military technologies, scarce resources, geographical diversification that anticipates fragmentation of blocs, and positioning in currencies assets that emerge as alternatives during transitions. In the comments, tell me which current conflict you recognize as a continuation of this century-long blueprint, and which region you think will be the stage for the next act. More importantly, understand that you don't have to be a victim of the blueprint. Each restructuring creates opportunities for those who recognize the pattern early enough. The directors profit because they anticipate. You can protect yourself and prosper for the same reason. The blueprint continues. The question is whether you will be a conscious actor who benefits from the transitions, or an unconscious audience who pays the costs. History does not repeat itself, but the financial template remains constant. And now you know the blueprint. The war that began in 1914 never ended. It just changed stages, refining methods but maintaining objectives. Recognizing this is not pessimism. It is realism that allows intelligent navigation through the next restructurings that are already being orchestrated.